Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points with Matt and Matt. Um, Today is another policy episode. Matt and I, both watched an intelligence squared debate on the question of student loan forgiveness. And of course, that's a big topic nowadays, partly because Joe Biden is suggesting that he will uh, do implement some policy that will improve the issue. But it's been an issue for quite a long time, and many people feel very passionate about it, especially people like college students such as myself. Um, Although I will say I have not had to take out any student loans, not because I'm rich, but just for various circumstantial reasons. So when you hear me make my arguments, it's not coming from a place of I'm desperate to get my student loans forgiven because I have no student loans. Um, but I think a good place to begin would be with the fact that I am seeking um, a I'm seeking. I want the United States to have universal education. Um, I want to see um, a. I want to live in a country where everyone has the opportunity to go to university. At the moment, we pretty much have universal pre K through 12, and it's mandatory. Um, but we don't have universal college. Um, and I think a variety of reasons, both just the lessons that college teaches you, and I think more economic reasons. We need to help people. We need to help people go to college if they want to go. Obviously, they shouldn't have to go. Um, so that kind of that ties into student loan forgiveness, I think, because of there are both there are like economic pressures that kind of, you could say, force students to go to college, and then there are certain like educational pressures as well, or at least that there are reasons to go to college which will significantly improve how much you're educated, which again kind of goes back to economic pressures and your ability to function in the job market and whatnot. So I kind of see it as we are punishing people. Well, not directly, but indirectly, we're inflicting suffering onto people for kind of issues that are beyond any one individual. And actually, the funny thing about this topic, it goes back to our longstanding disagreement on, the individualism versus the community, because one could make the argument. Well, we won't go into this at the moment, but I'll just lay this marker down. One could make the argument that this is an example of an issue which requires collective action and not individual action. But that's a lot. There's a lot I threw a lot out there. Just a lot of general thoughts as usual. So you can take the reins from here.
Okay, so I'm going to wind us back a little bit. So for you laid out what the topic is, and if anybody wants to look it up, we watched the debate on Intelligence Squared. I know you noted that, and it's about if they should forgive student loans. The panel is two people who are essentially arguing that it should be forgiven unilaterally, and these are two people who are clearly like people on the left. And the people who are in these debates are academic-oriented folks. I jotted down their names. It was Ashley Harrington and Dalia Jimenez on the for side, and then on the against side was Nick Gillespie and Beth Akers. If anybody's in libertarian circles, they're probably familiar with Nick Gillespie because he's the editor at Reason Magazine, and he's been in those circles for like 30 years. And then it looked, I think the impression I got was Beth works for AEI, which is a conservative think tank. And well, one of the reasons I want to reel us back is because I think talking about the kind of nitty gritty points that they argued and how we specifically see some of those main points might be interesting because we agree that some of the arguments that were made in general were bad, and I think we'll agree on some of them being good. And a lot of the broad things you just laid out in the beginning, I think are actually not relevant to this issue because of some of the narrow things they debate. So I think some of the stats that Nick Gillespie kind of lays out, kind of I would put in dispute a lot of things you've suggested in the beginning, just based on the things that are on the ground true. So I think that that's where I'd probably end up pushing back to there. But to give a little more context, just because I'm assuming people who listen to this don't necessarily watch the debate, the two people on the for side, I don't want to stereotype them too bad, but a lot of arguments they're making are appealing to certain type of demographic divides. So they appeal a lot to how there are gaps in racial wealth and education, and how a lot of people who take out loans are people who are from more poor families. So I think that's one block we might want to talk about a little bit. I'm not sure if that's, I think you have more thoughts on that than I do, because I think you're a little tougher on your own side, I guess. And in some way you're more on the for side. And I don't think you're that sympathetic to that argument they're using. And I think a lot of people on the left, especially of the Bernie type brand, aren't sympathetic to looking at things through that identity politics type view, because somebody could simply say, let's forget about race and let's talk about class. And we can acknowledge that class is that race and class are intertwined, but it doesn't need to be racialized. We could just talk about how it holds poor folks down in general, and it's a bigger problem for poor folks. So I'm guessing that was your criticism of that angle they took. Do you want to talk on that a little bit?
You gave a good summary of my main thoughts, but I will expand a little bit on what you said. I don't think it's wrong, like necessarily, to bring up the fact that, say, the way we finance college in this country disproportionately affects, say, African Americans, or disproportionately affects. Well, I guess I would, if I have to emphasize it, I would emphasize it more from a class standpoint. But I do think the issue here is kind of an issue which needs to be, if we were crafting legislation about this, I would insist that we craft it in such a way which tackles the issue as broadly as possible. Because I don't think it's an issue so much of, like, racism, quote, like and full stop. You can't, like, that doesn't fully grasp the issue. It is, and this is why I was going back to the individualism versus collectivism thing. And I realize you want to get more into nitty gritty and not kind of broad abstract points. But I do see this as a issue that needs to be addressed, or that the collective, quote unquote, needs to address. I don't see it really being addressed just from everyone, from every single individual making certain choices here and there. It goes far deeper than that. So yeah, I think that expands on what you mentioned, what you said.
So another, and this bounced off what you just said, but another parallel I saw with this specific debate is a parallel I guess I would compare to talking about healthcare in the United States. And one of the dialectics I see go on a lot is people on the left criticize the status quo, and then they argue that see how bad the status quo is. We should have, universal healthcare. We should expand Medicaid, something like that. And then people like me, I agree with all their criticisms of the status quo. I just don't think the proper way to fix the situation is to go to universal healthcare. So I think something similar here applies. And I think one of the interesting things about it is in the context of the actual debate being about, should student loan forgiveness happen? Because a lot of, like everybody on that panel kind of said, yeah, something's broken here. And that's kind of part of what you're getting at here. You're saying that there's, in our society, if you're going to use those terms, if you're going to say there is a society in the United States of America, there is some sort of problem with higher ed in terms of funding and people taking out loans and the inflation in tuition costs. Now you can ask people, how should we solve this? And I think like if you asked on that panel, if you asked the editor of Reason, Nick Gillespie, he would have given you a slew of policy solutions that have nothing to do with, debt forgiveness. But the people on the for side, no matter how regressive you explain to them that their policy was, if you explain to them that most of the people actually will pay off their loans and it's not even a big deal, if you explain to them that a lot of these people have higher earnings and will eventually pay them off without much trouble, it just looks bad in the moment. You could lay all that out, and in the end, they would say, but the system is broken, so we should forgive these loans. The other people who are on the against, or the people who are on the against side, like Beth Akers, she was kind of saying, well, here are some intermediate things we can do that can fix tuition problems or paying back loans, but you don't have to actually do you don't have to actually do student loan forgiveness. And I would even go as far as say student loan forgiveness doesn't even fix the problem, because if you only do student loan forgiveness, you still have everything else in place, and you might even make the future loans more you might make them more predatory because they might have less certainty about their investments. So that might actually inadvertently make them more costly and raise the interest rates higher, because it might be a more risky investment on the lender's part if this type of legislation happens. So there are these consequences here. So one of my big takeaways is, if you actually look at the debate confined to should we forgive student loans, even if you bought into some of the rhetoric from the for side, it didn't seem like this was an optimal solution by any means. And to some extent, they even accepted that it wasn't an optimal solution. So even if collective action is needed in your mind, I don't think that this is the way to go. And they weren't convincing that this was the policy to go forward with.
So it's almost hard for me to, fully talk about this debate, because there's just so many, there's so many fronts I want to tackle. But I guess to build on one thing you were saying, I was actually interested in the editor for Reason Magazine. I was interested to hear what he had to say. And I don't know how you've felt about his arguments. At some level, I could almost see you saying he was a bit blue-pilled. But maybe, yeah, I guess in the context of this particular debate, you might have been more sympathetic to him, and you would just be more critical of him in other arenas. But he seemed to specify, like, yeah, I believe we need to help the poor. I believe we need to help people from poor families pay for college. And that's really my main concern. I'm less interested in necessarily defending student loan forgiveness alone. I'm not going to defend that till the cows come home per se, if I can be persuaded that it's not a good solution. But as I mentioned, the economic pressures they don't make college, like, they don't mean everyone has to go to college, but they do mean if you don't go to college and you don't have a backup plan, if you don't go to college and you don't go to a trade school, if you don't go to a college and you don't inherit your father's business, if you don't go to college and you're not okay with working, or you don't want to work for McDonald's for 40 years or so, there are serious personal costs to that. So something does have to be done, and I guess we all then would agree on that matter.
So I'm not going to really defend or attack Nick Gillespie. I mean, I listen to him a lot. Like, I listen to a weekly show that he's on, so I probably heard him talk I probably listened to him talk for like hundreds of hours at this point. So I'm not gonna act like I think he played his role well. I don't think it's indicative of his full philosophy in either direction. Now, what I will say is, yeah, obviously the system is broken, so something does need to get done. Now, I was trying to lure you into a bit of a trap here. And since we are, since we do this show to go back and forth on things we kind of disagree on, if I'm going to do my due diligence, I think my goal here is to at least make you think about things a little bit. So the trap I'm trying to lure you into here is I kind of laid out how this policy is in a lot of ways suboptimal. And this is something that I was kind of talking about. This is something that they talked about in the debate. And I left out one pertinent piece of information the first time I just laid it out. So to rewind a little bit, it's not a good policy because, as Nick Gillespie said, a lot of the people whose loans would be forgiven, because the context of this debate is it happens under the idea where people are egging Joe Biden on to canceling up to about $50,000 in student loans for everybody who has student loans. So canceling 50 grand of it. So Nick Gillespie points out, most people who have that much loans are going to pay them off. And a lot of the rebuttals from the other side is, yeah, but a lot of people don't pay them off. And then they respond with, yeah, but it's mostly people who dropped out of college. At one point, a person on the for side, it was Dalia Jimenez, she concedes that the policy is very suboptimal. And she says, yeah, but that's the policy that's on the table. So we do it. If we can afford the military industrial complex, even if this policy is suboptimal, we can dump the money to do this. So what I'm getting at is you can say, hey, we need a solution because it's broken. But what I'm hearing that Intelligence Square makes a debate because the specific topic of the debate is relevant to our current politics. And they're debating something that is very relevant to our current politics. But of course, it's a suboptimal policy that's really, really inefficient. So even if it kind of helps some people who are in a bad spot, it mostly is going to be a subsidy of people like me. Because this is why I'm not going out of my way to pay off more of my loans than I owe, like every month. So every month I could afford to pay like $600 more a month and then save money in interest. But I kind of figured that if a Democrat got elected, they might cancel my student loans. That's what I learned from Bernie in 2016 when he ran. So I kind of like not in a rush to pay him off. They froze him for the last year. I could just be a subsidiary of this policy. I might just pretty much bank 36 grand because they decided to cancel my loans. Why would they do that? I don't know. I'm very capable of paying them off. I could actually pay them off tomorrow if I needed to, but I'm not going to. So the only real choice is, I guess what I'm getting at is it's easy to sit here and talk on a podcast and suggest that there's an optimal policy that exists, but doing that neglects the fact that the optimal policy is never the one that is implemented. And I think this debate was very illustrative because the topic of the debate isn't the optimal one, and we need to confront that. So I guess what I'm getting at is it an okay plan considering that's on the table? Should they do that even though there are all these flaws anyways, even though we can recognize that it does almost too much for no real reason at the expense of the US dollar and the taxpayer directly and indirectly? Is it still worth it? Because ideally, yes, you can say as a collective, we should care for the lowest low. But as Dalia, the person for the policy said, this is what's on the table. So that's the trap that I lured you into, and I filibustered long enough to hopefully give you time to think of a response you're comfortable with.
So I'm going to respond to your question, and then I'm going to ask you a question in turn, because I think that's you mentioned something, and I think I need to clarify. I need clarification on, but so. When you're talking about politics, often I think it's like a question of how do you maximize benefit in the short term versus how do you maximize benefit in the long term. Sometimes these, these are contradictory. So like, one doesn't have to. I don't have to say like this, student loan forgiveness, excuse me, is the best policy possible in order to approve of it. If it can benefit people's the average person's economic status in the short term. So in other words, like, we need, as we've mentioned, the educational system needs to be reformed, and just forgiving everyone's student loans, say tomorrow, if everyone who has student loans in the country, if they were all forgiven tomorrow, but nothing else was done, then you're just kicking the can down the street, not actually picking up the can. So I see what you're saying, and I do think it's important. I don't want the Democrats to forgive student loans and then just do nothing else. I don't want them to use this as an excuse to do nothing, which sometimes happens. Sometimes they make marginal improvements as an excuse to not fix the broader issue. But I think it just goes back to the burden that student loans can have on people. Now, of course, it becomes a question of like, where do you draw the, if you're going based on income, where do you draw the line? At some level, I don't know. I have contradictory thoughts on this. I guess I could understand why. I could understand both sides. I can understand why someone might draw a line at a certain point and say, okay, you draw the line where, the people who can, or you draw the line where the people that would benefit, you're taking the student loans away from don't need the help. On the other hand, you might even be able to make an argument that says, well, then just, get rid of everyone's student loans across the board, because then that will greatly improve everyone's economic status, which will improve the country's economic status as a whole in the long run. But I like to make clear on the podcast, of course, that that these podcasts, for me at least, are more about me thinking deeply about the issues. I'm not really here to say specifically, I have all the answers. You need to, if only everyone listened to me, if everyone followed every single policy position I have, the country would be perfect. I just wanted to clarify that. I think there was something else I wanted to say, but I've forgotten it off the top of my head. So may I ask my question, or would you like to respond to what I just said?
No, that's fine. I think we can leave that part there.
Okay. What is in your opinion, what is the optimal solution to the student debt crisis?
Okay. Well,
I realize that's a big question, but I need I want to understand your point a bit more. If you have a counterpoint to it, unless they're just using this, as you say, as sort of a thought experiment.
So I thought what Nick did a good job of laying out in the debate is he laid out how the crisis isn't that it's a student. There is no student debt crisis. So it's kind of like saying, just because somebody has a loan, it doesn't mean that it's a crisis. So not all debt in everybody's personal life is created equally. I guess an example of this would be, I know somebody who graduated from college in May of 2020, and then they got their first job with a salary, and then they bought a car that they paid 15% down on, and they make a payment every month, and then in 5 years it'll be paid off. Well, that person has manageable debt. It's so they can have something now, instead of foregoing that thing till they had it on cash. But technically, you could count that as a liability, and you can say that is an amount of debt. And then what they do is people aggregate that debt across a bunch of consumers, and they'll say, look how high consumer debt is in the United States. So the only bad consumer debt is consumer debt that's not going to be paid off. Now, one of the things I think is deeply omitted in the discussion about student loans and student debt is that the whole reason why people go to college to get the degree is because it makes your income trajectory higher for the rest of your life. So the thing is, if you don't get a degree, then you're likely to make a certain income that is lower than if you do get a degree, especially if you pursue a degree in a good major. So a lot of people who get degrees in good majors don't, even if they have very high student loans, like you can think of lawyers. Law school is very expensive. Unless you get into certain schools, you're probably not going to get a scholarship. But then those people go and they become lawyers. So even if they spent a ton of money on loans, if they actually worked in the profession and didn't give up, or if they didn't fail out of school, they actually end up paying off their loans. So that part of the problem isn't, it's not a part of a crisis. So when they say that there's a $1.4 trillion student debt crisis, that I think that's, it's not a lie, but it's a mischaracterization. It misunderstands what aggregating people's debts is. So I kind of push back on it, saying that it's a crisis to any degree. Now, I think there's an issue where tuition is artificially high. And I would say the reason tuition is artificially high has to do with a monopoly in higher education, because the way the government accreditates programs is a monopoly force. It's not easy for like 5 college professors could not quit their job at a public university and start an online college where they teach the same courses they taught at that public university for credits. This is something that Thaddeus Russell did at Renegade University. He quit his college job and he has a website where you can take all these interesting classes. But guess what? You don't get an accredited diploma. That's not how higher education works. It comes down to everything being monopolized in a way that drives up prices. And because everybody knows the income trajectory is higher for graduates, people go to college. And because loans are so much more accessible, that drives up demand even more. and then that drives up price even more. Because when demand increases and supply is the same, price goes up. So I would say it's really an artificial constraint on the supply side. And instead, I mean, you and I both know, we watch a ton of YouTube videos. I listen to a ton of podcasts and audiobooks. I listen to audiobooks through 2 different libraries. I've consumed so much information in the last, 3 years since I graduated that is beyond what I learned in higher ed, and that was free. So we know that information is free. But actually having a professor give you individual instruction, we can understand where those costs are. But really, all the other extracurricularly costs that go into your tuition, it's kind of all arbitrary based on an old system that doesn't need to exist anymore. So I would say if you revolutionize teaching, you can revolutionize academia, and there's no reason why it should cost tens of thousands of dollars for people. All of this is just I guess, academia and a government monopoly. That's what accreditation is. That's what I think the problem is. And I think that's what, I think if you actually push Nick Gillespie on it, if he wasn't arguing for his little position in this context of the student loan forgiveness debate, he'd probably say, this is the transformation we need to see. But we have institutions in the way of that happening. So that's the big picture answer. I think student loan forgiveness is a slam dunk no, because it's a regressive policy that is way too broad for no real reason. And it's not free to cancel somebody's loans. I know the government authorizes loans and subsidizes loans, but these are held by private investors that have to get paid off by somebody, or else there'd be deep economic consequences. So it's not free. So if it's inefficient and it's not free, like it has a cost, it's a really bad idea. That's going to end up costing taxpayers a lot more than it helps people. So I think that's slam dunk bad idea. And the real answer is to, free market everything up. So yeah, I know that's a long answer, but that's my whole thoughts on the higher ed situation.
But I wonder why, this is kind of a follow-up question, I suppose. Related to, well, you talked about a lot, related to the last part you said. Why are we drawing the line when it comes to like economic spending? If we take off our anarchist hat for a minute and put on our government hat, why are we drawing the line and saying the government can't, or these loans have to be paid off, the government can't do it, given, and as you know, the money, the tax money goes to all kinds of stupid things. Why do we, and this isn't you, of course, but some people would defend the military industrial complex, and so I could ask the pretty simple question, well, why are we spending money on that when we could spend money on covering these loans and forgiving them at the same time? So I guess in other words, it's like using tax money in a manner which makes more sense.
Yeah. So one of the
how
things
that relates to student debt forgiveness. Yeah.
One of the things that was ever present in this debate is the people who are arguing for it seem to believe that there's like no real cost of canceling the student loans, and it's the kind of mindset that thinks there's no real cost to increasing spending. And like the thing that makes me think of to ask them is if a window broke in the Senate building, should the government spend $200,000 to fix it? And then you'd say something like, well, no, you shouldn't spend $200,000 to fix a broken window. So that's kind of how I'm viewing this issue. It's one of those things where it's like, well, we could print $1.4 trillion. And it's like, yeah, but if the only thing you're doing is fixing a problem that isn't actually a problem for 90% of the people the money is allotted to, then you're really fixing maybe a $150 million problem with $1 trillion. So it's like, well, that's stupid. So it's like, yeah, you could say if the budget was going to be $1 trillion a year, and we could decide to spend $200 billion on war, or we could spend $200 billion on canceling loans, then I'd rather cancel the loans than do war. It's like that. I'm okay with somebody making that point. I just don't think that's how government works. Though the way government works is they just add all the spending together. It's not really, things aren't contingent on each other, because then they just print more money and then they issue more debt to foreign nations. So it's like, do we want to issue $1.4 trillion worth of debt to foreign nations so we can do a policy plan that's actually helping a much smaller group of the population than it is suspected? And I think the easy answer is no. If you're going to use that much money, you might as well give people UBI And then those people with UBI could pay their student loans every month with the UBI, and then the other people could spend their money on stuff you want. So stuff they want in their most efficient ways. And that's why I always joke, though, that Andrew Yang is the technocrat, where if you actually used his ideas, those are the ones that are closest to being efficient, because then you can give all the people money and they'll use it in the most efficient ways. If you gave me $1,000 a month, I wouldn't put it towards my loans because I'm going to pay those off anyways, but I'll still do the things that the Keynesian economists believe in. But if you just cancel my loans, then there's so many reasons why that's very inefficient and suboptimal. So I guess what you're kind of getting at is, should I compare it to things that are clearly bad, like war spending, or should I compare it to things like student loans that people don't really need paid off for them by the government? Now the other thing I would throw in there, just to add a wrinkle in it, though, is when you do talk about things like military spending, you have to remember that the military is essentially a government jobs program that artificially employs a ton of people who aren't doing anything helpful, because a lot of their war efforts are things that we don't think people should be doing. But you do have to remember that it does give a lot of people who aren't very skilled a lot of money. So even if you think of the war effort as something that's bad on a moral level, you do have to remember that it is still like a Keynesian economic plan. So even if you did cut, hundreds of billions of dollars from the military and then you pumped it into a different sector, a lot of those times it might actually have a net neutral economic effect, because the similar effect is happening in the military spending. If you're talking about employing people who are 19 who want to go into the army. So that's just another wrinkle. But in the end, it's not efficient. If you want to be efficient, you would actually read the, you'd read the studies that come out of AEI, you'd read the studies that come out of Heritage Foundation, and then people would debate them, and people would argue if the data was reasonable or not. And then even if you don't have any of my assumptions, you could figure out what seems more optimal if you're a statist. That's not what they ever do. And that's kind of why I don't think democracy ends up having solutions that are good. And I can't really think of any examples where the optimal solution has really occurred, or even something close to optimal. Yeah.
I kind of find myself in a position where I feel like asking you questions would be more effective than me spouting opinions, but I'll say a little something here. It's kind of a question / opinion piece. But I guess I need more information on, or I need more explanation as to why the student debt crisis isn't a thing, in the sense that I don't see it as, and I'm not trying to mischaracterize you, but I don't see it really as kind of a individual cost, for one. And I also don't see it as an issue of 90% of people are going to pay off their debts themselves anyway, so it doesn't matter. I see it as people, even people who get important, or people would say relevant degrees. I'm not talking about someone who gets a degree in, what degree am I going to pick on? Let's say sociology. I'm not saying someone gets a degree in sociology, then works at Starbucks and has a bunch of student loans and oh no, I'm saying there are people who, supposedly do the right thing. They go down that right path, but they're shackled with this debt for years on end, and it just significantly has an impact on their lives. I need you to kind of talk more about the human cost that I see.
See, I think that this is actually just a quantitative. It's a disagreement, because I think what you're saying is, I think you're appealing to you're appealing to the narrative about student loans. And I think it's only a crisis if you actually do pick on the sociology kid who ends up at Starbucks. That's the only time it's a crisis. Because if somebody gets out of college and took a reasonable amount of loans, their payment might be $200, $250 a month. But if you get a job that pays $40 grand a year, you can afford a $200, $250 payment a month. And if you can't, then, one, if you can't and you get behind on your loans, the interest rates for loans are actually generally subsidized already by the government. So they don't usually get deeply out of hand. It's really the people who drop out of college, and it's the people who are underemployed are the ones who suffer. If you end up getting a job in your field and then you make the expected income from your field, it isn't something that shackles you. It's the people who get master's degrees in sociology and spend $150,000 that are screwed. even if they get employed in their field, if you end up being a social worker that makes 40 grand a year and then you have $150,000 in loans, then yeah, you might be screwed. But that's really the rare case. And the weird thing is, and this is kind of like why sometimes I feel like it's easy to get lost in this conversation, is part of the conversation that we started with was something along the lines of, we feel driven to go to college because we know that's how you end up making money. We know it's hard to make money with only a high school degree. But then we all know that sociology degrees and art degrees don't really pay money. Like we know that if you get a master's in something that leads to social work jobs, and if you put yourself 150 grand in the hole, knowing you're going to get a 40 grand salary on the other side, we all know that's how it works. So it's kind of weird that the conversation. I'm not saying you're wrong to do this. It's just almost like a paradox in the debate. Is a lot of the reasons we know that everybody's drawn to go to college is because they have to do that to make a good living. But then we know those same people will pick majors that they know won't pay them well, and they'll get in bad debt. But the average person, like if you looked at the public university where I live, Temple University, like I think by far I'm under the impression that the biggest proportion of students go to the business school. And I'm not saying the business school is particularly rigorous, because it's not at all. And I'm not saying I have a high opinion of those people, but those people can get jobs that make $40,000 a year, even if they're lodged with even if they don't get any subsidies from the state or any if they don't get discounted tuition, you still can affordably pay off your loans. Like the average person isn't shackled in the way that the narrative says they are. And that's kind of what Nick lays out. And the other thing is the poorest people, it's the most expensive for them because they don't have any wealth. They don't have a family member to pay off an amount for them. But the other thing that you have to remember is, for that reason, a lot of them don't even go to the college. So the poorest people, if they go to college, might be saddled with more debt. But the main proportion of people who are going to college are the richest people. So a lot of the poor people that we're talking about who should have avenues to go and get a higher degree aren't even in the population we're talking about when it comes to the debt crisis. Like a lot of the people who go get these bad degrees and have a lot of debt are people who come from middle class and upper middle class families, and they make kind of poor financial decisions. So yeah, I think it is like the situation where that the mean, the average person isn't actually in crisis mode. It only looks like a crisis if you aggregate the data in a way that's kind of misleading. And if we wanted to talk about the people who made bad decisions, but we should feel bad for them because they were in their 20s or like 18 when they made those bad decisions, and it's weird that we subsidize them in making bad decisions, like I don't think that's right. So if we wanted avenues to help them once, then maybe there's a discussion there for something narrowly targeted. But that's why I'm so dismissive of the overarching cancel 50,000. I think that makes sense.
So I think it's pretty common knowledge that people our age, let's say, are a little older, a little younger, their economic life is very different to some degree from, say, the economic life of our grandparents or even our parents. Now this is a broader issue. I'm not trying to get lost in the woods here, but we're not. The economy is not as good as it was, and so I think when I think about things such as student loan forgiveness, I kind of go back. I'm going back partly to what I said earlier. It has to do with allowing the most amount of people to thrive within the economy that we're given. So because the economy is really not that good right now, debt is more of a problem. If you're wanting people to have a certain level of living, so we're kind of condemning people to less. We're condemning people to thrive less when we say you got a degree, a degree in this subject. This was a bad decision. The cost is totally on you. And the funny thing that I find, or a funny aspect that I find about this debate too, it's a bit of a side point, but I do want to say it before you respond. if one person or two people or 10 or 50 or whatever, if a small group of students say, all right, I'm not going to pay my student loans, nobody cares, right? Because they're just a few people. Obviously, the people that they're paying the loans to care, and they'll have to do something about it. But if most people, and this is why, again, I brought up individualism versus the community. But if most students come together and they say, we're not going to pay student loans until you renegotiate, until you um, the loans are renegotiated, until uh, the lot we're given is more fair in terms of these loans, whatever specific detail you want to focus on, then the loaners have to come to the table and say, all right, we're going to negotiate with you. So that's like why I talk about certain issues being like collective issues, because if a few people act against the stream, nobody cares. But if large groups of people act against the stream, then people actually care, because that means things come to a halt, and something has to be done to make sure the things can get back to some semblance of normalcy. So that's my piece said for those two points of the debate.
Yeah, and I'm all for voluntary collective action, and I think there's clearly a place for that. One of the issues I think that is really obvious here, though, and this is why I hearken so much to free market economics, is because when you have a flexible economy that doesn't have things regulated in certain ways, you can respond to things in ways that are, I think, typically better for people, and it meets them where they're at. But then when you get unilateral issues, like where they try to apply something one size fits all to a large population, I think things go haywire because they're either inefficient or they don't serve people in ways that are actually helpful to them. So a lot of that, what comes to mind is like, I know I can pay off my student loans. I got my degree in a thing that I know could get me employed. I did well in school. I know I'm fine, and I know my debt will never really be a burden unless unless something really bad happens to me where I can't get employed in the future, and suddenly can't pay off my student loans. Like, there's no reason for my debt to be a burden. Now that means I really don't have anything in common with people who do see their debt as a burden because they did make bad financial decisions when they were 18 or 19. Now, the thing is, of all those people who went into degrees that aren't smart financial decisions got together, the reasonable thing to do would be, after they negotiate and forgive those debts, it would be that lenders would respond in a way that is reasonable, and they would probably treat people applying to different schools at a college differently. So somebody was applying to a college or a school in a college that was known for having people come out that actually pay their loans because they got a degree in economics or finance or something. They would probably give them more favorable terms than somebody who went and got an art degree. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Because if it's your money and you're saying, I'm going to trust somebody with my money now so I can get paid back, and I know that person who got a finance degree is way more likely to pay me back than that person with the art degree, then you should give them better terms. If that's how the numbers come out. So I guess what I'm saying is there is a place for people to default in the system, but we have a system. The United States has a system where all of this is centrally planned, where the government subsidizes certain loans at certain interest rates, and that everybody pretty much gets a loan to a very high degree if they meet certain one-size-fits-all qualifications about parent income. It doesn't matter what you're going to school for. And that's where I think a lot of this falls apart. And that's why I think we've kind of ended up where we are, is because it's not that hard for a very young person who has parents with a certain income to get a very large value nominally in terms of a loan for a degree that is a very bad future job prospects. Like, you can get a history degree that has no future job prospects, and you can spend a ton of money by going to a certain type of college, and the government's telling people, give that guy the loan. And if those people knew, hey, the odds of that guy paying me back are really low, then they wouldn't give that guy a loan. We wouldn't be in this problem in the first place. So I think that's the thing you're trying to navigate. And I don't think the answer is print more debt. The taxpayer will eventually be liable either because of X, Y, and Z reasons, either related to the US dollar or by future taxes. I don't think that's the way to get around it. there was something I want to wrap back to. I'll give you a second to respond, but I do want to wrap around to the economy being bad right now, because I think I disagree with you on what the current economic situation is, and it's something I want to clear up. I think it's like literally a statistical difference. But but I'll leave that at where it is. We can come back to it.
So when I think about, or I want to think a little bit about what you just said. So, if someone gets a finance degree, go easy on them in terms of loans or loan forgiveness, or not even forgiveness, but like just the terms of their loans. And then if someone gets a degree in art history, well, that's a bad financial decision. You're going to pay the brunt of that because you made a bad financial decision. I'm not sure it's quite, or I guess I don't quite trust the idea that people's education, in terms of like financing their education, it should be judged on, or people should be judged on what degree they're getting. So I keep asking you questions, but I would like you to flesh that out a little bit more, and then you can talk about the economy as well.
Well, I would say something like your degree is a tool for employment. It's a credential. It's an accreditation. So if you major in art history, there aren't a lot of jobs that are hiring for people who got art history degrees. It doesn't actually have to do with education, because anybody can read like a million art history books for free on the internet if they actually want to be educated on it. People can join online courses for like low money. In the end, the college system has a monopoly on accreditation. So if I'm as an individual was going to lend you $20, then if I'm gonna loan you $20, well, I talk to you every week. We argue. You can't really get away from owing me $20 if I brought it up every week, right? And since you're a somewhat responsible person, I would expect at some point to get Venmo $20, just like how you expect that I'll Venmo you $10 for losing a bet to you some 5 months ago. So it's one of those things where it's like, okay, well, what is the reliability that I get this money back? So if you're just talking about the individual transaction, it makes sense that if you expect someone to pay you back 99% of the time and somebody to pay you back 70% of the time, you would treat them with different terms, because your odds of you losing all your money, or at least a large sum of it, is like 30% higher with one group than the other. So if you say, okay, well, I need to rectify this, how can I rectify this? Well, I have to charge a certain rate, or I'm going to be more exclusive about who I give loans to. That's like the natural course of events. Now, I'm not saying people should stop caring about art history, but what I am saying is if somebody's making a financial decision about accreditation and job credentials, then it shouldn't be everybody in society subsidizes your decision because we don't really care. Because we're just going to treat everything as equal. And if we run into a problem like we have now, we'll just unilaterally bail everybody out. because that's how we ended up in our situation right now, is by treating them all as equals. And they're clearly not equal when we're talking about a job accreditation that costs $50,000. So I think I think I'm pushing back from the status quo, and you're kind of defending it by saying, shouldn't we be kind of neutral to if somebody is interested in learning about something? And I say, well, you're thinking of it in the wrong way. It's not that they're interested in pursuing art history. It's that they're interested in pursuing a career in art history, and you want to subsidize somebody's whole career path. I'm saying let the people who are funding the art history degrees decide if they actually want to fund the art history degrees, because there might not be many career paths in art history. And we're talking about people who are putting their money on the line. And I think I'm going to bring up the broad topic of voluntary consensual interactions, but like when it comes to people who are making big bets of their money on 18-year-olds, I would rather not have the government trying to decide how people should kind of make those gambles. I would want the people who are with boots on the ground saying, I'm lending out all this money. I need to figure out if I'm putting it to good use. And what you end up doing is you either end up driving up costs for everybody, which is what I would say is happening now, or you have investors leaving the game, which also drives up money. Because if people treat everybody the same, then everybody either gets treated with higher interest rates, or there are less loans to go out there, and then less people can get loans. So what I think we have right now is everybody's treated the same, which means the finance students are subsidizing the art history students. And I don't see why that should inherently be fair.
May I respond before you talk about the economy? So I guess this is the part where I go back to, and this is sort of why I am defending a universal healthcare system, a system of getting college degrees funded through the government, and obviously it goes back to tax policy. But and this is a slightly esoteric point, but I think it's important to make when we're talking about kind of educations. The I don't think you can quite quantify, or when we're thinking about like degrees. Now, obviously, this is in the context of student loan forgiveness, so I can understand why you're thinking about it in economic terms. But to talk about education for a second, I don't think you can really think of education wholly in economic terms, because I don't think you can always quantify certain cultural benefits that people can get from taking a wide variety of courses, and even from getting degrees in the humanities, which everyone has derision towards because of the various reasons we've been talking about. So I don't think it should be a matter of, well, this isn't this is a you're going to make much less money getting this degree, therefore you're not going to get any student loans. I think if the government is able to fund, so if the government is able to fund at least a college to a degree, I'm not even necessarily saying that private colleges should be banned. But if people are given the opportunity to go to a school funded through the federal government, I think in the long run, again, that will everyone from the art history student to the physics student to the finance student is contributing to one degree or another to, again, this thing we call society. So I'm kind of sidestepping, I guess, what you're saying, using the government control. But yeah.
I think where I push back on it is just I would just reiterate that college is really credentialing. I know it is education, but in the end, I can read all the books I want on my own and be very educated. I can't read all the books on my own and then walk out with a degree. The unique reason why college is expensive is the monopoly on the degrees. And since we know that these degrees are expensive and some of them have deeply different some have different impacts on people's future incomes, it would make sense for investors to treat it differently. And I don't think society should necessarily value or not value art history majors. That's why I don't think anybody should be making these decisions. That's why I think you should just kind of let things play out in the free and peaceful way. Because I don't think I'm a pretty aesthetic person. I watch so many movies. So I'm actually like a person who defends the arts in that way. I don't defend the fine arts. But I guess the last thing I'd want to do is misconstrue that I would I don't think I have the appropriate view of how to value art history, just like I don't think you do or any individual person does. I think most people underweight it or overweight it, or they have a view of it. I don't think that there can be a proper societal weight on it, and that's why I think it's unfair that we think that then certain people should be subsidizing it, because then you are putting a weight on it. And it's like, well, just because they're contributing doesn't mean we should automatically subsidize other people. Like, I'm not going to force somebody to open up a degree program in 70s Italian giallo horror films just because I like those and would love to study them for 4 years to get a credential, even though it wouldn't give me a job to pay off a loan. But that was me being provocative, and I think we beat that horse dead. So what I want to say about the economy, you kind of had a throwaway line about acknowledging that young people aren't necessarily making great money right now, and the economy is tough right now. The thing I would note on that, especially in light of COVID, one big thing that I think is kind of misconstrued is the current state of the economy. Because even though unemployment's high, a lot of it is concentrated in very specific sectors. And I don't think it plays a relevant part in our current conversation, because the jobs that are disproportionately lost right now are all in the low educated service sectors. So people who are getting degrees right now and are looking for work aren't actually looking for any of the jobs that have been temporarily dismantled because of the government's reaction to the coronavirus. So even if a lot of people aren't employed right now, and it's easy to look at things and be like, oh my God, it's so bleak. So many college students are sitting on their couch. Well, it's like, well, it's because those are the people who are actually working as servers and as baristas. It's not the people who had office jobs. A lot of it's really only airports, hospitality, and restaurants. So when we're thinking about places like like anybody who got a degree that would lead to an office job, a lot of those people found work even when coronavirus policies haven't been put into play. I know plenty of people who got jobs in May and June of last year after they graduated. So the other point I wanted to tack on is young people always complain about not making good money and then having a ton of debt. But one thing that is really a good counterpoint to that is Thomas Sowell famously cited in, I wish I knew which book off the top of my head, but he kind of tried to dispel a little bit about income inequality by talking about longitudinal studies. So instead of just looking at the income distribution over time, like I don't know if you ever look at economic studies and they talk about the Gini coefficient, and that's all about how much money is concentrated in the top percentage of a population. But he kind of flipped it on its head and he said, well, let's not talk about how much is concentrated in one moment of time. Let's look at it over a long period of time. And the real thing is young people are always disproportionately poor because they always have the lowest amount of work experience. And if you think about job setting where you get a 4% raise every year over year, compounding interest, you make way more money by the time you're 45 than you do when you're 25. That just makes sense. And if you look at these longitudinal studies, a lot of people who start in the lowest sectors is really just because they're young. And then they move up in terms of the income distribution. So it's not to say, oh, the American dream is alive and well, but it's to say if you're a young person and you're in the middle class and you're complaining that you only make $40,000 a year, it's like, I'm guessing that in 10 years, you're not going to be in the lower class if you've gotten a desk job and gotten in the door. So I think those are just a couple of misconceptions I wanted to dispel. And I think those are very relevant to talking about student debt or debt for young people.
Another question slash op-ed. What? So I take your point. I mean, like obviously, if I'm 21, so I haven't had as much work experience as a 50-year-old. So obviously, when I'm, if I'm applying for a job and a 50-year-old's applying for a job, it might be more likely. The 50-year-old might be more likely to get the job in the sense that he or she has more experience than me, and unless actually I was going to go down a completely irrelevant rabbit hole. But again, I think it goes back to the power that the power that debt has to kind of just cause people's lives to be disrupted and to be disrupted for a long time. So like if I appeal to like the conservatives listening to this and I'm like, well, do you believe in family values? Do you believe in people working hard? Do you want kind of the Jordan Peterson type scenario where like people have meaning and like they're contributing and to their society and all this stuff? I think you can make a very solid case for the fact that student loans are disrupting those very things that people say they value. So that's really what I'm thinking of when I talk about the potential benefits of student loan forgiveness. I'm thinking about you're taking away a certain responsibility people have, but you're taking away in order for people to gain other responsibilities, which they wouldn't be able to gain, or at least it takes them much longer to gain when they're stuck paying, 100,000 that they earned from this or that degree. I don't think it's not just a matter of everyone, getting a finance degree or everyone becoming a doctor or a lawyer, and then it'll all work out because of doctors and lawyers and financiers make a lot of money. I'm slightly straw manning, I understand. But it's about allowing, again, as many individuals as possible to thrive in the long run. I'm kind of repeating myself, but I think I haven't quite heard a satisfying rebuttal to that. So if I'm repeating myself, that would be why.
Yeah, I think the reason why I'm not honing in on that as much is just because I think that narrative is just not true. So I think that that affects people who end up in, I guess, college educated jobs that we'd consider low paying. So it's a lot of social workers and teachers. And a lot, I think that applies to people maybe their first 4 or 5 years out of college. But outside of those groups of people, I don't think that's actually the situation. A lot of adults, I never meet an adult in their 40s that is college educated that isn't a teacher that has complained about their student loans still burdening them. A lot of them get through it easily at some point in their 20s or low 30s. And I just don't think this is a particularly, I guess, accurate characterization of the situation. I think that's why I pushed back on a lot of the messaging of it, because I just don't think it's representative of things. And also, I just want to mention, it's not just that if you apply to a job and a 50-year-old apply to the job, they're more qualified. It's just literally the people a lot of times stick with their jobs for like more than a decade, and when they do, their salaries compound. So it's not just, oh, somebody became a CEO. It's just like a 5% raise doesn't sound like a lot until it's like 15 years in a row, and then all of a sudden you're talking about people who are making $90,000 a year, and it's like somebody who's in their late 30s making like close to six figures isn't bad, and I shouldn't be, society, quote unquote, shouldn't be concerned about paying off their loans for them when they're 20 if they're on that trajectory. And I don't really think that that's keeping people from making all sorts of life decisions. It seems like people are doing that anyways, and if they're not, it's for cultural reasons. I kind of think this is a big non-issue that's kind of brought up by a lot of people who think it could be an issue in their life, but it's really because they haven't graduated yet or are in those select narrow fields that I think they've been, I guess, set up for walking into this type of bad situation. And that's kind of my closing remarks on it too. I know we've been a little repetitive. Is there any? There's only like one other random thing that caught my eye that I could mention that kind of got my attention, but I'll let you respond, and then if you want to wrap up, I'm okay with that.
Well, I just wanted to respond to one point, and then you can either, and I can make my closing remarks, and then you can either add, or you can make another point if you want to, or we can wrap up. I'm fine with either. But like you mentioned, teachers. So you've never met, what is that, 40-year-old or something, unless they're who's crippled with debt, unless they're a teacher. And so then I think to myself, and I know obviously we have strong disagreements about public schools as well, but I think to myself, whatever your experience in public school and whatever gripes you have about it, teachers are important. And so I'm thinking to myself, well, okay, a elementary school teacher, she's doing something important. Now you could say we need to privatize it all day long, but I don't think you can make the argument that like elementary school teacher is just completely superfluous, and his or her job is they don't need to public elementary school teachers don't need to exist. It's like, just we'll find that benefit in other ways. No, they're doing an important service to their students, and they're doing important service to the broader community, because those students are going to grow up and become janitors and CEOs and politicians and whatnot. So then again, it becomes a matter of, well, if this person is doing an important job, but it's not a job that pays a lot of money, I don't think we should say, well, you're just going to be shackled with this debt because you didn't become a financier. So
I think everything you just said made me realize how much I love how markets work. So I think the best way to say my response to that is, who's also important is babysitters. Babysitters are very important, because they are watching your kids usually when you have something to do that you can't watch your kids, and you can't just leave your kids alone. Like, you need somebody there to watch them, because a 4-year-old might kill itself on accident. If there's no one there to make sure that doesn't happen, then you're in big trouble. Now, here's the thing: just because a babysitter is important doesn't mean that they have or need to have a lot of skills, and it doesn't mean that there aren't a ton of people who could do the same job. So I think a lot of my issues with teachers are the same issues I have with how academia is a monopoly credentialing system, because I don't think teachers should need the credentials they need to be teachers, especially in like the K-8 arena. You should need to spend yourself, $100,000. The only teacher I had who complained about his student debt was my 5th grade teacher, and he went to a private Catholic college. So no wonder. And then he did all that to become a fifth grade teacher. And the way I think of it is he was a great guy. He's very nice. He's very funny. He's a very interesting teacher. And I went to public school, and I actually don't have as many gripes. A lot of people went to public school. But I still think all those people were essentially glorified babysitters. I think some people in high school and above might require specialization that would require more, more financial incentives. But I think you'd hire based on the skills you need. So if plenty of people can teach if plenty of people can teach third graders math and reading and English and all that stuff, then maybe they don't need the degrees that are required. Maybe they shouldn't have to worry about the loans because they wouldn't need those credentials in the first place. And a lot of people want to do that job, even if you and I both agreed it was a hard job. So it's like, sure, it might be hard, but a lot of people want to do it. So how unfair is the current situation if people are still wanting their dream to be to do it, even though the financial considerations aren't good? I think the real issue here is the requirement of certain credentials, and a lot of that is set by the government. So in the end, I think that's where I stand on it. But I do think public school teachers are generally parasites, and I don't have a high opinion of them, and I think they're glorified babysitters. So with that said, I don't mind they're paid low because they're not doing anything that special, even though it's important, just like a babysitter is. But they aren't that high skilled. There's no reason for them to need a literature degree and then like 5 extra credentials to say they can watch 25 8-year-olds. So I think that's really an issue with the credentialing. But that's going to happen when a million people say, I want to be a third grade teacher. And a ton of people do. So no wonder they're undercompensated. If everybody wanted to be a janitor, janitors would get paid even less somehow if you didn't have market restrictions on that thing. Like if everybody wanted to do my job, and if my job didn't require a college degree, then you'd pay people the minimum wage because people would be lining up at the door. Since that's not the case, I make a salary. So it's all about qualifications plus supply of candidates. I think that's really how it should work. I don't see why people should pay a babysitter, tens of thousands of more dollars than they currently are getting on the market. It seems kind of arbitrary to me. But the other rant I was going to go on was one of the things that happened in that debate. A girl mentioned the kind of narrative you were talking about shackling student debt on people and how it debilitates them. And then she said a throwaway line about how this is what keeps them from building their life and like buying a house. And that started hinting at all the things about bad incentives of people who already can't afford student loans getting into the housing market and stuff like that. So I kind of wanted to touch on a lot of people we're talking about that can hardly afford student loans. If those loans are holding them down, then maybe it's not keeping them from doing the other things because they'd have the same problem if they pursued other things. So if somebody's shackled by their student loans and somebody said, well, that's keeping them from buying a house, well, then it sounds like they can't afford a house anyways. It sounds like they can't afford these other things if they're already struggling with student loans. So I don't think it would actually be a thing that replaces. It's kind of like if your goal of your policy is to get people to spend more money and put more money in the economy, if you free someone of their student loans, it doesn't sound like they're actually going to be paying for something different instead. It sounds like if they're having issues and needed the support, then they won't actually get a new burden that is then their new shackle that needs to be canceled. So that was something that kind of caught my attention. But yeah, I apologize for rambling a lot this episode. I just kind of have a lot to say on economics in general. And there's just so many incentives that come up here that seem wrong to me. So yeah.
I just wanted to say something or make a few quick remarks on credentials, and then you can wrap us up. But so I don't know. I guess from my perspective, I don't quite trust the free market, as you've been talking about, to find ways to fill the need that credentials fill. I can understand why the government does it terribly. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm not even necessarily against credentials. I'm against a system where credentials are the rules and regulations and hoops people have to jump through for credentials are backwards and insufficient and stupid. And I'm just not sure just free association is going to, or not free association. I'm not sure voluntary association and just, allowing market forces to do their thing is really going to allow for that. So I just wanted to point that out there. I don't think it's fair to attack credentials in and of themselves. And then this is a meta point. But I'm noticing this is a meta point on the podcast itself, actually, because I think this is something I wanted to add. So sometimes when you talk about policy, or I guess I'll start with this. I've been a little tuned out of certain policy debates recently for just various reasons. And I'm trying to get back into the swing of things. But so it's like these conversations are interesting to me at the level of I feel like I feel like I would be perceived like if I were watching myself, if I weren't myself, but I were watching myself, I would perceive myself as the stupid person in the room. I would perceive myself as, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. He talks in general statements. He talks in abstract philosophical principles. He's just his head stuck in the clouds. He's an idiot. And here you are giving far more substantive and substantial arguments to these things. But all I can say for myself, in defense of myself, is just that I have not studied a lot of these matters as much as Matt has, and so I don't have my thought process is not fully developed yet. And I'm working on that, like I said, but at some level, these conversations are slightly unequal, and I'm okay with that. And I think they'll be more equal as time goes on, especially when I get out of college and have more time to consume podcasts and news articles and whatnot. But I just wanted to add that to I felt like some listeners might be having certain thoughts related to the kind of format of a lot of our podcasts, and I thought a little explanation was in order.
Well, and that's the first thing on that is, and that's why we touch on philosophy a lot, is so I get to be the dumb one who you start name dropping people, and I just kind of sit here and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna wait for him to say something of substance because I don't know any of the people he's talking about, so I need him to actually say what their idea is so I can agree or disagree to it. And that's also why when we disagree on philosophy, I'm never arguing about what a philosopher's intention was, which is actually 99% of the philosophy academic discourse is interpretation, it seems like. Yeah, and then on policy, I think that's why a lot of the show ends up being fun, is because I'm generally, I'm so in this circle for me where it's like I know the talking point, I know the counter argument, I disagree with, and then I'm willing to sit here and like half argue with myself, and then kind of try to lob up to you something like, okay, I know that we don't think this thing works, but how do you look at this from a person of certain principles, and how do you think this should pan out? And then that's where we go. And a lot of times, I think we make some ground, or at least we think about things in interesting ways. But yeah, it's not supposed to be the Young Turks. It's not supposed to be you yelling certain things at me and me yelling back. I'm not supposed to be Crowder and you're not supposed to be Cenk. We're not doing that garbage. We're trying to be more not necessarily pleasant about it, but we're supposed to clearly be working towards something, or at least investigating it. And it doesn't. You don't need to follow all of Joe Biden's words to be able to investigate that something's up when all these people say is certain kind of cliche things. Yeah. And I did have I'm not going to talk more about the episode. We already talked about that enough. I think we can leave that where it stood. Oh, and the other thing I want to say is, yeah, I hope that these aren't perceived as ANCOM owns neoliberal corporatist, because that's the last thing you are, first off, and that's just not the intention. My intention isn't to put you in a box. My intention is more maybe I want to make you think about things, and that's why I threw that hypothetical at you where I was like, okay, here's the reasons why this isn't that efficient, but what if that's the only thing that is ever allowed to pass? And then you have to like think about that, and it's like those are the kind of questions that people should think about if they're actually active in our democracy, even if I'm not a person who is even a proponent of that existing. I think that's the fun of the show. But all of that aside, If you want to watch more of our episodes, you can find them all on YouTube at Beyond Talking Points. You can find them on any of the major podcatchers. You can find more content from me at the Obey Podcast. That's a solo show I do. You can find me on Twitter at the Obey Podcast or at Matthew T. Keck. I don't tweet that much, but when I do, I'm usually triggered about something dumb that's coronavirus related. So if that stuff is your sensibilities, then feel free to investigate that. Or if that's not your sensibilities, then probably don't want to go there. My solo show is the Obey Podcast. I usually rant on stuff for about half hour. If you can't tell, I'm a little congested. I've been battling a cold, which definitely was not coronavirus. I just want to reiterate, battling a cold this week. I took a week off last week, and then I was like, I had some things I wanted to talk about, and my throat was just hurting, and I've just been feeling like garbage. So I haven't gotten the chance to talk about a couple things that I've really wanted to rant about, but there will be more content on there shortly. Matt, you can find his stuff. I'm just gonna keep talking. I'm not gonna give you a chance to say it. You can find his stuff on his YouTube channel, The Anti-Philosopher. He does vlogs. He does some book reviews. He covers all sorts of content that is a little less policy based, but it's more sensible and sophisticated in all the ways that I'm not, as I'm the blunt Neanderthal and he is the person who waxes and wanes on philosophy and literature. So you can find all the enlightened content on his channel, The Anti-Philosopher, on YouTube, and you can reach out to us through those means. I hope you guys appreciated listening to this, and I feel free to check out the catalog. But for now, signing off is Matt. Thank you.